In 1852, some 6 or 7 years after the publication of his first, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, in fact, that was maybe more than that, because that came out in 1845, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So in 1852, Frederick Douglass made a very important speech. He'd made quite a few interesting speeches. There was one done in 1876 when the monument that we call the National Monument of the Emancipation of the Slaves, which had an image of Abe Lincoln and the enslaved African being freed in 1876. April 1876, he gave another fantastic and really, really hard hitting speech in which he declared Abraham Lincoln as a very important person, but under his rule. But he also gave an unscathing, so he gave very scathing description of Abraham Lincoln as not as being the president of the white man, and not always being somebody who was thinking about the interest of the African American, um, even as he gave credit for that. But that was years later. But in 1852, there's a great speech, another one of his great speeches, which is always worth looking at, and it's called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" What to the slave is the 4th of July? In 1852, this is less than 100 years after the American War of Independence, the Revolutionary War. Frederick Douglass is faced with, and this is while slavery is still going on. Frederick Douglass is faced with the opportunity to speak on the 4th of July, and he asked the question, why are we celebrating the 4th of July, and what does it mean to the slave? And it's a brilliant talk because what he does, he says, look, the very heart of the emancipation, the Revolutionary War, and the War of Independence of America was this idea of freedom. And of course, he points out that was the rhetoric and that was the language that Americans wanted to break from the yoke of being enslaved by by the British government, by the British monarchy. They wanted to be liberated from it. They wanted to be liberated from the tariffs and the taxes that they had to pay, and they wanted to develop their own nation and be independent and have their own identity and be given dignity and fair rights in the world. And he said that very impulse, that very same impulse, existed in them as white people, but for some reason, in the midst of that, when faced with the question of what they did with Africans, they continue to enslave the Africans and continue to deny them the same freedom that they were talking about. So Frederick Douglass then says, but the same Declaration of Independence and the same Bill of Rights that are articulated there, he said, when he gave that speech, he said for the enslaved person, the 4th of July is an insult. The 4th of July is an affront. And the 4th of July, he argues, is the opportunity to recognize the hypocrisy of American ideas of freedom and American ideas of liberty and American ideas of the need for the sort of proclamation of its desires for freedom. Because as far as Frederick Douglass was concerned, as long as slavery existed and was sanctioned by this very same American government, then the American government was functioning under the premise of something fundamentally hypocritical, immoral, and damaging. Douglass was not a sort of quiet and gentle critic of American society. He was not. He was, in fact, somebody who said this was a massive problem in American society. And he did declare, at the end of of that speech, he did declare that the only way this was going to change was going to require some kind of revolutionary action and some bloodletting before the freedom of Africans was going to be something that could happen. Why did Frederick Douglass have the confidence to say that? Because he had also been witness to um, an earlier revolution that took place before his birth, which had taken place in Haiti. Because at the same time that Frederick Douglass is looking at the American Revolution and looking at American society in which he was a slave, he was also able to look at the Haitian Revolution, and the only way that and the Haitian Revolution remained at that time the only successful act of rebellion by an enslaved people, to shake the to literally win a war against one of the most dominant armies, Bonaparte's army, the French army, and to take their own position of leadership. And he said, and that was evidence that for any black person who is enslaved and so on and so forth to be free, they would have to seize that opportunity themselves. Frederick Douglass was not necessarily advocating that slaves rebelled, but he was observing that slaves rebelled. He was observing that slaves wanted freedom. And so in his autobiography, one of the most interesting and very sensitive observations that Frederick Douglass had, and because he was both scathing and um, uh, quite adamant, but at the same time he was very sensitive to understanding the very, very exquisitely sophisticated nature of enslavement, the psychology of enslavement, and the impact that it had on a people. He would observe that white people would declare that African Americans seemed to be passive in the face of slavery. Many of them seemed to be passive in the face of slavery, that they would be enslaved, and that while some of them would run away and some would escape, and many of them would attack their masters and so on and so forth, many did not. Many stayed in those conditions of slavery. And what Frederick Douglass sort of was very astute about observing, he said, is that if you think that that was evidence that they were accepting of their slave condition in the sense of saying it was okay, he said what you have to understand is the very thing that was the most vulnerable thing for the African American, for the African in America, was the very thing that kept them trying to retain a sense of themselves on the plantation, and that was family. Because one of the things that is not really, sometimes is forgotten, is that escape from slavery meant abandoning one's family, abandoning, in many instances, one's children, abandoning one's mother and father, abandoning the network of family that existed even under the pressures of slavery. It meant abandoning it, and meant a life of isolation. It meant a life of constantly running, and it meant a life of tremendous loss. And so he observed that one of the reasons why so many enslaved people had to make the decision to remain inside of slavery was to be able to help protect their own families, to find ways to protect their families. And this was the choice that was made. The other thing he observed was that slavery was designed to dispirit the black, the African, dispirit them, to take away any desire for freedom or any desire to resist the system of slavery. And it was a very interesting and astute observation by Frederick Douglass, because he said one of the things he discovered was when he was well fed, when he was not well fed, when he was starved, when he was deprived of food, he just lost all capacity to even fight. He got depressed. He got weak, because he said that deprivation, of that caloric deprivation, was a tremendous depressant, was because it had chemical impact on the body and so on. And he said there's a way in which slavery sought to control even the spirits of these people by creating draconian structures in the society, including starvation, the lack of food, and the uncertainty of food, which dispirited them. And he said very interestingly, when he was well fed, when he was giving opportunities, when he was looked after, when he was going to church and so on and so forth, instead of making him more loyal to the plantation, even instead of making him say, okay, I'm going to stay on the plantation, he said he wanted to leave. He wanted his freedom. And of course, there's something interesting about that observation because Frederick Douglass is demonstrating that, in fact, it is true exactly what the planters were saying. The planters were saying that if you treat the enslaved person with any modicum of their humanity, they won't want to be enslaved. And Frederick Douglass said, instead of seeing this as a reason to then punish them, it should be seen as evidence that these are human beings, and human beings desire freedom. Innately, they desire freedom. And Frederick Douglass then, was then observing that there are two extremes to this process because despair can lead to absolute violence and resistance and so on. But he always had the view that the African had the capacity. They had the capacity to make a life for themselves and to be independent and to be able to function effectively in society. And he rejected the idea that the enslaved person, if the enslaved person was freed, they would become a burden on the society and they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. He rejected it. Now, at one point, one of the things that happened during the Civil War, when the Civil War began, was that Frederick Douglass was from the beginning an advocate for African Americans being part of the Union Army. He believed that if slavery ended and African Americans didn't fight for that slavery in the Union Army, it would not have not just symbolic, but hugely actual value for the African American. It would be one of the worst things that could happen. And he fought to the extent that he demanded and gave up his sons. By then Frederick Douglass had two sons, and he gave up his sons and said his son will go and fight in his sons will go and fight in the war, at risk to their lives. But he wanted to see them have a chance to be a part of that quest to fight against slavery. And the establishment of several units, over 200,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War as soldiers, and many of them died in the Civil War. In fact, the number could be higher than that. That may be the number that perished in the Civil War. These men gave their lives for this freedom that they were fighting for. And that was really because of the advocacy and the dogged persistence of Frederick Douglass to demand this. Because, of course, Lincoln was not having it at first. But eventually, as the war became more difficult, Lincoln eventually began to recognize the value of doing this. And we have to understand that is that Lincoln's decision to end slavery, to write the Emancipation Declaration, was to see that act as a military act. It wasn't an act of morality, but a military maneuver, because what Lincoln became convinced of by people like Douglass and other people advising him was that if you liberate the blacks in the South, and remember the Declaration of Emancipation was only for the slave society, slave states, the states that were in secession. It wasn't for everybody. It was for only the slave states that were in secession. And the idea was that if the slaves were told that they were free, and they were a big support, a big logistic support for the Confederate for the Confederacy, logistic support, because they were the ones who were having to dig trenches. They were the ones that were following the army and building bridges. They were doing it because they were enslaved. They were forced to do that. And what Lincoln slowly recognized and became convinced by was that if he would give them their freedom, and once they knew they were free, they would abandon the Confederacy and seek, because they would be given a haven, an amnesty if they escaped. And so it was a military decision. It was a fundamentally military decision that actually worked, right? And so the combination of those two things, African Americans fighting in the war, African Americans being freed, and so on and so forth, were a big part of the ending of slavery. Frederick Douglass was always asking these questions, and asking the question of what was the nature of slavery, why was America involved in slavery, and seeking to find ways in which he could challenge America to end its participation in a process and a system that he thought was devilish, dangerous, and the worst thing in the world.